Okay. Since we have already a pretty good group of people on board, why don't we get started with the presentation? And obviously, first of all, I want to thank everyone who has joined us so far. And in particular, of course, to also thank our two presenters for today, Manuel Pastor and Ty Vile from the University of Southern California. The title of the presentation is California Welcoming, California Becoming, Trends and Scenarios for Immigrant Integration in the Golden State. And this is one of several occasions in which Manuel Pastor has joined us for in-person and also virtual events over the past years. And I want to just mention briefly that Manuel is also the lead author of the strategic plan that was prepared back in 2013, 2014, that led to the creation of CIVIC. And that strategic plan was developed thanks to the contributions of many representatives of partner organizations that went to an event that also had follow-up conversations with Manuel's team. So the value of Manuel's work to our region, the Central Valley, has been very important over the years. I mentioned that every time we have him as a guest, whether in person or in a virtual event, there are always multiple requests that I get afterwards for people wanting to have access to the presentation and also to video recording. That is the value of his work in an ongoing basis. And Manuel, even though he is also very busy and actively involved in all kinds of different things, always makes time to participate with us in the Central Valley. A few weeks ago, I had the pleasure of being at a conference at USC, in which Ty Le also was the lead presenter of work that I thought was really fascinating, and that also presented a number of valuable insights for the present and future of California. So as a young researcher, Ty, I want to welcome you to the Central Valley to join us for this event, and hope that we can continue to count with your participation in subsequent events down the line, just like as we have done with Manuel. It's been very valuable, and we really value and appreciate the high quality data and analysis that both of you bring to the table. So very briefly, Manuel Pastor, even though he has a really long professional curriculum, I just want to mention that he is Distinguished Professor of Sociology and American Studies and Ethnicity, Turpanjian Chair in Civil Society and Social Change, and Director of the USC Equity Research Institute. Do check out the website, tons of really valuable information that they have in the Institute. And Ty Vile is postdoctoral scholar at the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy. Thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Ty, for joining us. And thank you, everyone else who is also already part of this webinar. And it's all yours.
Thank you, Jesus, for that very kind introduction. Although the fact that I began with you in 2013, and the fact that Ty's a young researcher has just made me feel kind of old. So, and having just turned 66 about a week ago, which I keep arguing is the new 65. I'm definitely feeling my age. So we have a lot of data to present. We will send a PDF of the presentation to Jesus afterwards to send to you. So please, if you're seeing something go by a little bit too fast, you're going to have a chance to study it on your own later. And Ty and I will be back in a couple of weeks to administer a quiz about the data, because heck, we're from the University of Southern California. So let's go ahead and Ty, why don't you bring up the presentation? So what we're going to be talking about is from some research that we did for California 100, which is a project trying to take a look at the future of California over the next 100 years. And I think the big message we want you to take away from today is that the future is not necessarily like the past. And one of the biggest things about the future, which is really critical, is that California, which has been used to having immigrants come to it, 50% of the immigrants coming into the United States in the 1970s and 1980s came to California. That while we've long been an immigrant-rich state in the Central Valley, an important part of that story, we are now a state that actually needs to compete for immigrants. And to compete for immigrants, their energies, their entrepreneurial startup capabilities, their workforce attachment, their contributions to our society, we're going to need to be even more welcoming so we can become a much more inclusive and productive state. Next slide. So another part of the changing demographics, and I'm going to talk a little bit about California, and then Ty will take us on a deep dive into the Central Valley, is that while it's always been the case that our largest sending country has been the country immediately to our south, Mexico, that's dramatically changed. If you look at the current composition of immigrants, for immigrants in California who have been in the country for more than 30 years, about 40% of them came from Mexico, with the next batch of countries being Philippines, Vietnam, El Salvador, followed in very small numbers by China, Korea, Taiwan. If you look at the immigrants who've been here for less than 10 years, you'll see that only about a fifth are from Mexico. And now another fifth from China and India, which India wasn't even on the screen in the previous period. There's certainly Central Americans that are in the mix, but we've gotten to be a much more Asian immigrant population, and that is part of our future. Next slide. And you can see that by looking at this slide, which takes the race, ethnicity of immigrants by recency of arrival. And you can see that for those that immigrated more than 30 years ago, more than half call themselves Latino in the census. However, that shrunk to about a third of those who immigrated less than 10 years ago, and about 45% identify themselves immigrants, more recent immigrants, as Asian American. Next slide. The other thing that's meant, which we'll see in a few minutes, is that the changing nature of the immigrant population and the fact that we've got less immigrants coming from Mexico has also meant that our undocumented population is now much more long settled. While there's been tremendous political heat about undocumented immigrants, the number of undocumented immigrants in the United States actually peaked in the year 2007, declined between 2007 and 2009 because of the recession, people going back to their home countries, et cetera. And it's actually been on a steady decline ever since, through the Trump years to be sure, but beginning even before that, because the fertility rates in Mexico have dropped dramatically, less push factors from there, et cetera. What that means is that the people who are undocumented, who are in our state, have tended to be here for a far longer period of time. So now more than 2/3 of undocumented immigrants in the state have been in the United States for more than a decade. They're long settled. They form families, as we'll see in a minute. They really ought to be labeled undocumented Californians because of the roots that they've sank. Next slide. And you can see this by looking at let's just look at the column on the left, the all. 6.1% of all Californians are undocumented, but another 5.8% of Californians who are US citizens are family members living with a family member, undocumented immigrant. Another about 2% are people who have legal status, lawful permanent residency. What that means is that nearly 14% of California's population is either undocumented or living with a family member who is, implying that barriers based on legal status, being unable to access unemployment insurance, being in a position where you weren't able to get the CARES aid from the federal government has enormous ripple effects on families and on communities, and not just on undocumented immigrants themselves. Next slide. Again, part of what's going on is that We're no longer as big an immigrant destination location, and many migrants are moving to other states. As a result, the share of our population that is foreign born is actually on the decline in California in the last 9 years, while it's been on the increase, continued increase in the US. And it's been on a much sharper decline in places like Los Angeles and San Francisco, the main entry points. Next slide. But one bit of news that's really important for you to hear is that, and you'll probably like this, the Central Valley is the future of the state. What do I mean by this? If you look at the share of the population in 2020, 2040, 2060, what you're going to notice is the first bar is that currently about 10.3% of the state lives in the Central Valley. But in 2040, that'll be nearly 12%. And in 2060, it'll be nearly 13%. A larger portion of the state is moving to the Central Valley, attracted by lower housing prices and numerous other factors. But more than that, a much larger share of children. So while currently you only have about 10% of the state's population, you have 13% of the state's children. You've got a lot of families who've moved for housing costs, job opportunities, et cetera. And that slates up to 15% of the state's children in 2040, to 16% of the state's children in 2060. You can see that by contrast, my own county, Los Angeles and Orange County, we put them together, is actually shrinking as a share of the population and certainly as a share of the children. I still think LA is the future. I'm proud of my location. But the data is telling us that the Central Valley is the future of the state. And so to dig more deeply into the Central Valley, my colleague and postdoc scholar, Tai Lei.
Thank you, Manuel. So building from what Manuel has presented on California's shifting demographics, the Central Valley's immigrant population has also changed over the decades. So the Central Valley is not immune to some of those drivers Manuel was speaking on that's really pushing immigrants away from the region. But the data shows that the share of the population who are immigrants is declining in the Central Valley. So in particular, we see that the percent foreign born in Fresno, Kern, and San Joaquin counties saw a general increase from the 1970s until recently. So like California, this region has since begun to see a decline in the share of the population who are immigrants. So this is, again, in part because less immigrants are potentially coming into the area, but also because of, as Manuel mentioned earlier, a growing population of second generation children born to immigrants. Oops. 1 second. So decades ago, immigrants were more likely to be concentrated in urban metros like the Bay Area. But over time, the number of immigrants moving to the Central Valley began to really grow, whether for family, work, or greater opportunities they weren't really afforded in the coastal cities. And we can kind of see this in the maps. On the left-hand side, we see where immigrants were in the 1980s, and on the right, the 1990s, and then moving on to the turn of the century, and so on. So by the turn of the century, more than 650,000 immigrants were living in the Central Valley. So that's about 7.3% of California's overall immigrant population. And then by 2019, close to 1 million immigrants lived in the Central Valley, about 8.6% of California's immigrant population. So immigrants make up about 22% of Central Valley's population. Nearly 2 of every 5 immigrants in the Central Valley are naturalized, and the presence of undocumented immigrants are also nearly as high, a much closer ratio than what we are seeing at the state level or in other regions like Los Angeles. So looking within the Central Valley region, the share of immigrants across counties are relatively close, but it's worth mentioning that some counties have a greater concentration of naturalized citizens compared to others that have a higher concentration of undocumented immigrants. So taking a step back, we can see from the data that more than half of the population in the Central Valley are Latino. By nativity, about 1 in 3 Central Valley resident is a US-born Latino, whereas about 1 in 6 are a Latino immigrant. And so though it's relatively a small share of the total population, Latino immigrants have a strong presence though it's a relatively small share of the total population, Latino immigrants have a strong presence within the immigrant community. So among immigrants, 7 in 10 are Latino, compared to the next largest immigrant group, where 2 of every 10 immigrant in the Central Valley is either Asian American or Pacific Islander. So given their strong presence, it's not surprising to see that Latino immigrants make up the vast majority across immigration status, though it's worth noting that Latino immigrants are disproportionately more likely to be undocumented and less likely to be naturalized than other racial ethnic groups. And we'll talk a bit more about this later on. So when looking at immigrants' ancestries and countries of origin, specifically in the Central Valley region, we can see how the share of immigrants who came from Mexico is on a decline, similar to what we saw at the state level. But though they still make up by far the largest share of immigrants in the Central Valley. It's important to note how the share of immigrants from other countries have been on a steady rise, including immigrants from India in particular. And we can see this trend even more clear when we look at the racial ethnicity of immigrant groups by cohorts. And we see the shrinking share of Latino immigrants and the rising percentage of Asian American immigrants among those who have been in the United States for less than 10 years compared to those who have been here longer. And again, across immigration status, similar to what we saw at the state level, immigrants in the Central Valley are considered to be long settled. So even among the undocumented, despite some common misconception, 3/4 have been in the United States for at least a decade. Again, this is important as these immigrants, regardless of status, have been in the country for years, contributing to their communities and establishing roots. And so undocumented immigrants are important members of the Central Valley region. And we see this also when we look at family composition. So nearly 1 in 5 Central Valley residents are either undocumented or live with someone who is. So Latino residents make up 90% of undocumented immigrants or mixed status families in the Central Valley region. And as pointed out earlier, with the rising presence of second generation children born to immigrants, it's important to acknowledge and keep in mind that many of them, through family dynamics, will face strenuous barriers associated with status and legality. So it's no surprise to see that immigrants are an important part of the Central Valley's economic livelihood. Immigrants make up a disproportionate share in industries like agriculture, manufacturing, and construction, and oftentimes in very low-paying positions. And what you'll see also is that immigrants with different statuses are more likely to be in some industries more so than others. Again, it's because of their status. For example, we see the most obvious presence of undocumented immigrants in agriculture, making up easily the largest share across nativity and immigration status. And what this also means is that immigrants, particularly those who are undocumented, are disproportionately impacted by issues like the drought. The drought, which will likely only worsen because of climate change, presents momentous problems for undocumented agriculture workers who face other economic barriers, a pathway to other jobs, and may lack access to resources to mitigate the consequences of the resulting economic downturn we're seeing with the drought. So immigrants are present across industries in the Central Valley, but maybe more so in certain occupations than others. Considering the large number of immigrants in the agricultural industry, for example, it's not surprising to see that more than 4 in 5 farming, fishing, and forestry workers are immigrants. And immigrants are also a notable share of other essential workers, including 1/3 of food service workers and more than 1/4 of healthcare practitioners. Despite immigrants being such essential parts to the region's economic engine and livelihood, immigrants themselves face a multitude of barriers to economic inclusion, including lower wages. And in general, immigrants in the Central Valley earn lower wages and have less secure jobs, which translate to lower median household income than their US-born counterparts. And this is a point worth underscoring, as wage disparities not only impact immigrant workers, but also their families. And when disaggregated by race, we see the same trend of immigrants falling behind economically compared to their US-born counterparts. The exception, however, are Black immigrants who have a higher median household income than US-born Black residents in the Central Valley. And this is a similar trend we're seeing also at the state level. And it's not surprising, even when disaggregated by gender, immigrants have lower wages than their US-born counterparts, with immigrant women getting paid the lowest. And so this particular intersection of marginalized identities is important to really uplift as immigrant women face both gendered and nativist barriers to economic inclusion. By status, we see that naturalized citizens are the most likely among immigrants to reach wage parity with US-born workers, though the median hourly wage still lags by more than 10%. But across immigration status, undocumented workers fare the worst when it comes to wage earnings, earning nearly half of what US-born workers in the Central Valley are earning. And even when working full-time, undocumented immigrants are significantly more likely to be experiencing working poverty, where household incomes fall below 200% of the federal poverty line. So undocumented immigrants in the Central Valley are more than 1.5 times more likely than lawful residents to face working poverty, and nearly 3 times more than naturalized citizens, and nearly 4 times more than US-born workers to experience working poverty. So barriers to economic inclusion, including wage inequities, it leads to other consequences, including higher rent burden and more precarious situations of becoming houseless, unhoused, and if they lose their job or do not earn enough for that month. And so in the Central Valley, we see that immigrants are more likely to be rent burdened, with undocumented immigrants feeling this most acutely. And we see that 3 in 5 undocumented householders are paying more than 30% of their income towards rent, being rent burdened. And so with increasing unaffordability across the state, this number is likely not to go down unless wages increases or housing costs decrease. And again, this is an issue that impacts all Californians, regardless of status, and one that should be addressed locally and at the state level. So a consequence of increasing rent burden and a lack of affordable housing will push residents into overcrowded units. And so this is particularly troubling considering that we are in a pandemic and overcrowded housing presents health concerns. In the Central Valley, overcrowding is an economic and health issue that is most likely to be faced by undocumented immigrants. So next, we'll discuss how immigrants in the Central Valley are included civically, but we do so through looking at the conditions in which immigrants are able to more actively engage civically. So immigrant households in the Central Valley are the most likely to be linguistically isolated compared to other California regions. Nearly 1 in 3 immigrant households in the Central Valley do not have someone who is 14 years or older and speaks English very well. Again, so this has implications in how local organizations and the public sector may adjust their outreach strategies to more appropriately engage immigrant households. So by status, with nearly 1 in 2 households, undocumented immigrants are the most likely among immigrant households in the Central Valley to be linguistically isolated. And broken down by race ethnicity, though Latino immigrant households in the Central Valley may be the most likely to be linguistically isolated, other racial ethnic groups also face language access issues, including 1 in 5 white immigrant households, 1 in 5 Black immigrant households, and nearly 1 in 4 Asian immigrant households. And one important note also is that 1 in 5 Indigenous migrant households in the Central Valley are linguistically isolated. You know, it's important to note, though, that this estimate for Indigenous households is likely to be understated just because some folks may not identify themselves as American Indian or Indigenous or as one of the races included on the ACS. But it's the best we can do with the data limitation. But nonetheless, across these different groups, many different languages are spoken in the Central Valley, including within the Asian American community, within the Indigenous community, within the white and Black communities as well. So when considering language access, including for different Indigenous groups, it's important to really disaggregate these groups further to provide language and culturally inclusive services. And digital connectivity has been an important way to receive information and to voice needs and concerns, especially with the onset of the pandemic. Schools, public agencies, and service providers, including healthcare, they have relied on digital platforms to reach households. And so it's really concerning to see that more than half of immigrants in the Central Valley do not have access to reliable high-speed internet and or a computer at home. And so this digital divide in particular is even more stark for undocumented immigrants, as we could see. So naturalization provides immigrants with different avenues to be civically engaged, including voting and running for elected office. Today is election day. Hopefully folks who are able to have voted already. The Central Valley is home to more than 230,000 eligible to naturalize immigrants. At nearly 190,000, more than 80% of the eligible to naturalize in the Central Valley are Latino, the most of any racial ethnic group. And this large number of Latino immigrants who are eligible to naturalize is linked to their low naturalization rate and is associated with multiple barriers, including the chilling effects of how undocumented immigrants and mixed status families are disproportionately targeted by racialized immigrant enforcement. So despite being eligible, many immigrants are either not attempting to become citizens or lack the resources to really successfully naturalize. Again, one strategy to provide immigrants a louder voice is to improve pathways to citizenship or addressing citizenship as a barrier to civic engagement. So as an immigrant-rich state, California has relatively more progressive attitudes towards its immigrant communities. So for example, a March 2021 statewide survey by the Public Policy Institute of California finds that about 85% of adults support a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. And the survey also showed that 75% of adults support tax-paid healthcare for all, including undocumented immigrants. But such warm attitudes are not always reflected in reality. For example, undocumented immigrants in the Central Valley are significantly lacking health insurance coverage, despite many policy and advocates demanding health for all. And so this in 2019, the data is for 2019, we see that nearly 1 in 3 undocumented immigrants do not have health insurance coverage compared to 1 in 20 of US born residents in the Central Valley. And when we disaggregate this data by age, the gap is most stark for the older undocumented immigrants. So in the Central Valley, 4 in 5 undocumented immigrants aged 65 and older don't have health coverage, which again is concerning considering the barriers to a healthy life at the intersection of age and status. So it's worth noting, however, that California has recently passed historic legislation to expand Medi-Cal coverage to more undocumented adults. But without truly universal healthcare, hundreds of thousands of undocumented immigrants throughout the state will likely remain uninsured because they don't meet Medi-Cal's annual income requirements for most adults, despite experiencing working poverty. But unlike other low-income immigrants with lawful status, undocumented immigrants don't have the option to get subsidized coverage through Covered California. So despite California's warm attitudes and its declaration as a sanctuary state, we still see an increase in deportation originating in California. So this is concerning because of how it creates harm to undocumented immigrants and their families who rely on them for social and financial support. So again, this is another point that shows how warm attitudes is not necessarily enough to keep immigrants safe and help immigrants really thrive if actionable and immigrant inclusive policies aren't pushed forward. So now with that, hopefully we have a better picture of how immigrants are doing in the Central Valley. I'll hand it back to Manuel to speak on immigrant features and the major drivers that will shape immigrant inclusion in the region.
Great, thank you very much, Ty. You could see why we made him a postdoc at our Equity Research Institute. Magnificent job. I wanted to lift up one piece of work actually Ty and I have worked on before jumping into the immigrant futures, and it's about several of the impediments to naturalization. Some of them are what you would imagine, the cost of naturalization, questions about being able to speak English, etc. But what we have found in our research, which is kind of interesting, is that if you're in a mixed status family, that is that one of the family members is undocumented, you are less likely to naturalize, even though in some ways naturalizing could be a very important way to get more legal status to protect your family in general. People are concerned that entering into the naturalization process would wind up exposing them to the law. And so it then becomes a process that they're fearful of, or a process that becomes costly to them because they think that they really need to go talk to a lawyer before figuring out whether they can naturalize, even though one of their family members is undocumented. I say this in part because we've got our colleagues from Citizenship and Immigration Services, which I know work hard to encourage people to naturalize, but to be able to understand that this fear is there and it's showing up in the data work we've done for the state and the nation. What I want to do is to shift gears to talking about the future and understanding how the future might be a little bit different than some of these past trends. Next slide. So as we look forward in California, there's sort of 6 major drivers that are going to shape immigrant integration and immigrant inclusion. This is based on the work we did for the California 100 group that I talked about at the beginning. We're going to look at global crises, demographics, white supremacy, economic inequality, the terrible housing dynamics in California, and the relationship between federal policy and local initiatives. Next slide. So one thing for us to realize, and it has to do with the changing nature of our immigrant population, is the way in which global crises are going to have an impact on us. Who knew a year ago that Ukrainians would be showing up at the Mexican border trying to make their way into the United States? What we did know is that climate change is real and it's affecting harvests and livelihoods and survivability in Central America. And so from the Northern Triangle of Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, we have migrants who are fleeing both violence and economic displacement as a result of climate change, coming to our borders, wanting to enter into the United States. Why is this important? You know, people don't think about it this way, but California benefited from the immigration of the past because it was mostly adults who were ready to work, ready to jump into the workforce and start contributing immediately to our economy. Yet many of these new migrants are really much more like refugees. They're climate refugees or refugees from violence who are going to need support. This raises issues around narrative. It raises, because a lot of times we defend immigrants because of their economic contributions, but maybe we should just be defending immigrants because they're people and they deserve our help and they deserve our welcome, particularly if they're fleeing difficult circumstances. But that's going to change. As I've said, we're going to get more people who, if not considered formally refugees by the government, are a lot more like refugees than the immigrants of the past. And we're also going to be having a tremendous set of climate crises within our own state. The drought and lack of water that's affecting really agriculture and economic viability in the Central Valley, the heat waves that threaten farm workers, the fact some of new research shows that when there's these wildfires, that lots of undocumented immigrants get very hard hit because they're not included in any of the federal relief programs. So climate change, global crises, we need to be thinking forward and not just about the past. Next slide. Demographics. Now, when we talk about demographics, most people tend to think about the changing hue of the state. That is the fact that the state has shifted to becoming majority people of color, something that actually happened in the year 1998. That's thinking about the demography of the past, because if you forward cast, the state's ethnic composition will be pretty much the same in 2060 it is now. Will be a little more Latino and a little more Asian, about the same percent Black, same percent Indigenous, slightly more mixed racial group, and slightly less white Californians. But here's what's really going to happen is the aging of the state. And we need to change our minds about this, because in the past, when people thought about the aging of the state, what they were tending to think about was an aging white California and a young California of color. But here's a little secret. Latinos and Asians, every year, they also get 1 year older. And when you look at, next slide, the demographic projections for the state, something that's pretty striking is the median age profiles. The gray line is the white population. You can see that essentially the median age is flatlining. The white population is not going to be getting older. Which populations are going to be getting older? The Black population slightly, the Asian population a bit more, and the Latino population most of all. Why is this important? Think back to the data that Ty presented on seniors without health insurance, seniors living in poverty. If we've got a generation of immigrants growing up or through their middle age in poverty, not able to buy houses, not able to amass wealth, that's going to be a serious support crisis for those seniors as they age in place here in California. So thinking about the aging of California, the care for immigrants as they age, and how we think about a caring economy in which so many of the caretakers are Black women and immigrant women, a very important set of issues for the future. Next slide. And this just shows you this data point I mentioned, which I thought I showed, but I guess I'm showing, which is the high rate of immigrants in the Central Valley living below the poverty line who are seniors. You could see that for undocumented, it's twice the share of living below 200% of the poverty line as it is for US born folks in the Central Valley. Next slide. So the other thing to be paying attention to is the rise in white supremacy in the country. This is, of course, something that we thought, well, that's a thing of the past. But the last couple of years at a national political level, and even in some of our local state politics, have shown us that nativism still has an appeal, that white supremacy still leads to violence, as in Buffalo, New York, and elsewhere. And while there are these extreme cases of white supremacy and nativism, and sometimes they seem like they're very far away, they also occur in places within California as well, where there's a pronounced lack of welcome toward immigrants. And there's a set of more subtle phenomena, which is when we allow systems that have racialized outcomes, immigrant depriving outcomes to persist over time, such as increased criminalization, a lack of housing protection, uneven protections of workers. Next slide. Fourth big trend we think for California's future is economic inequality. And here, this is something that's been very persistent. Now, California is one of the third or fourth most unequal states in the United States. And in a way, it's been a benefit to us. You can see from the current budget surplus, that's because rich people cleaned up during the COVID crisis, and we've got a progressive income tax structure that's leading to a surplus in the state budget. But there's also really serious challenges with trying to repair the economic damage the market has caused by simply taxing and spending and subsidizing. We need to figure out what we do at the front end. And part of that is recognizing how deeply connected our state's labor markets are. The way I like to think about this is that behind every software engineer is an army of nannies and food service workers and gardeners. Where there's high paid service work, there's often complementary low paid service work. And think about it, this state is thriving because it's got high tech and biotech. But guess what? Those people eat. And part of what they eat is what's produced in the agricultural sector, often by immigrants being paid inadequate wages. California in the future is going to need to own up to the fact that these different kind of labors coexist. They both deserve respect, and they for the skills that they bring. Man, I gotta say, I hate it when people refer to certain kind of labor as low skill. When someone takes care of your kids, that's not low skill. When someone cleans your conference rooms as a janitor, that's not low skill. And anybody who's actually tried to go into the fields and pick, that is not low skill. So how do we make sure that that kind of work gets rewarded decently so we can address economic inequality from the get-go? Next slide. And it just shows you some of these gaps here in the Central Valley. Next slide. Last two of these is California's housing crisis is a serious problem for many residents. Go to the next slide. And it just shows you the rent burden by race, ethnicity, and activity in the Central Valley. You could see that the issue of rent burden is especially high for US-born Black folks, African Americans, and US-born Latinos and Latino immigrants. So this is something that affects immigrants. It's something that affects everyone. But it's really having an impact on those immigrant relocations that we were talking about. Lots of immigrant families are saying, well, people might not like me as much in Texas. The rhetoric might be harsher, but I can buy a home or I can actually make the rent. And so maybe I'll make that move. And we need to be a state that's attracting all kinds of labor, as I mentioned. And so we're going to need to deal with the affordability crisis, and not simply by pushing people toward cheaper housing in the Central Valley, but by dealing with affordable housing on the coasts, even as we expand affordable housing and living opportunities in the Central Valley. Next slide. The last thing is that we need to be thinking constantly about what can we do locally in light of the federal stymied policies at the federal level. We do hope for comprehensive immigration reform. It's something that demographers think is important, economists, and actually almost everyone who takes a rational look at our economy and the future. But of course, rationality and DC are not always words that go into the same sentence. And instead, we've had a pretty stuck policy agenda in Washington. And so what it does mean is that we need to act locally. Now, this puts special burdens on more conservative areas of the state where the support for immigrants may not be as strong. This is something that needs to be addressed, assisted, and built ties all over the state. Next slide. So, no talk by Manuel Pastor would be complete without a top 10 list, because I know this talk has gone on for a while. I know that you only remember 10 things. So if you only remember 10 things, well, the 11th should be that Ty Lay did a spectacular job. But if you only remember 10 things, here are the 10 things to remember. One, the future of California is in the Central Valley. People are moving to the Central Valley. It's where the kids are. The future is in the Central Valley. Two, and while we brought it up in the talk, we want to be more explicit now. We need to connect the struggle against racism with the fight for immigrant inclusion. If you think about the xenophobia that affects immigrants, so much of it is set by the terrain of anti-Black racism in the United States. So making sure that immigrant integration is not about immigrants hopscotching over Black people in the United States, California, on their way into the middle class, but that immigrant inclusion is making a commitment to make the entire society more fair, more just, more inclusive. Three, we need to tackle our underlying economic inequality. Improving people's mobility is part of that, making sure that all jobs are rewarded decently is part of that, making sure that people have the ability to start their own businesses is part of that, dealing with the intergenerational lack of wealth transfers for communities of color is part of that. Fourth, we need to recognize that our immigrant population is changing. It's going to be more refugee, more Asian. There's going to be differences about it. It's going to be older that we need to be paying attention to. Because of this, our narrative needs to change as well. If we're simply talking about immigrants as economic contributors, what does that mean for someone who turns 65 and is no longer working? Aren't they to be afforded a decent life as well? Shouldn't we think about a language of mutuality and care and one California? Next slide. So seventh, we need to both win and wield power. What we mean about this, although it's a provocative title, is that it's important to win key policy changes, but it's also really important to think about implementation. So it's totally cool to, somebody mentioned in the chat, win the ability of undocumented folks to be able to apply for unemployment insurance. Apply for health insurance. But if they're not counseled on how to do it, if it's not implemented so it gets out to communities, what good is it? If we've got barriers, if we've got people who are eligible to naturalize, but they're fearful, perhaps not with complete rationality, that this is going to expose their undocumented cousin who lives with them, how do we do the education to make sure that we're implementing, that we're wielding and making change and not just winning a policy change? Seventh, we should anticipate and prepare for backlash. Anybody who's engaged in trying to push rights for immigrants always recognizes that there's going to be some kind of backlash. So we need to be ready for it. Eighth, we must invest in immigrant leadership. It is important for those of us who are not immigrants, I'm a second generation person, son of an immigrant, to stand up. It's always important for all of us to stand up for immigrants, to stand up for Black folks, to stand up for LGBTQ populations, to stand up for the other, to stand up as allies. But it's also important to invest in immigrant leadership itself so that people can speak for themselves, educate people as to the nuances of need, and begin to voice their own concerns. This is great. This is what CIVIC's been doing. Number 9, we have to couple a shift in our rhetoric with a change in material conditions. Doesn't make a difference how welcoming California is if you can't afford to live here, and if the jobs don't pay decently, and if your kids aren't going to a school that delivers them a decent education. And number 10, our North Star must be creating a Central Valley and a California for all. With that, thank you very much. I think there's a final slide. Nope, just a blank sheet, which we can stop sharing. And thank you very much for your time. And I think it's open now for Q&A, which can come through the chat, or I guess I'll let Jesus let us know how we handle the questions and answers.
Well, thank you very much, Ty and Manuel. Excellent presentation. And I think you answered everyone's question. No, let's open it up for questions and comments. In the Q&A tab, there is a question from Eduardo. And this was regarding the data presented in the first part, in the PowerPoint presentation. Does this immigrant data include refugees and asylees?
Yes, it does. There's not very good strategies for breaking them out of the overall immigrant population. So our estimates for immigrants, we obviously have a group of immigrants that are undocumented. Within the undocumented, we include young people with DACA, and then also folks who have temporary protected status, TPS, because those groups don't have permanent documentation. But sometimes we do separate out the undocumented from people who have work authorization. On the immigrant side, we've got it broken out by people on student visas. So they're legal residents, but not eligible to naturalize. And H-1B visa holders, those are also legal residents, but not eligible to naturalize. And then we've got the rest of the foreign-born population, and that's what we use when we move to looking at time in country and some other characteristics to determine who is eligible to naturalize. And sometimes we've looked at refugees by tagging people from particular countries, but for the most part, we don't break that out. Ty, I wonder if you might say a word about that. I know, given your own experience, it's an issue that's important to you. And then maybe you could also say something about what we mean by that question that's in the chat about the Central Valley.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. So my parents are Vietnamese refugees, and so I have a particular interest in really understanding a bit more about the refugee community, especially in California. Again, it's very difficult just because of the strategies, as Manuel was talking about, is very limited in really parsing those groups out. And so sometimes we do look at immigrants from, let's say, for example, Vietnam to see how they're faring overall. But it is, again, very difficult to really dial down to like specifically refugees. So that's something definitely we're continuing to work on. And I know a lot of other folks are also working on trying to identify refugees and asylum seekers, just so that we can better understand where they are. So for Central Valley, we included the counties, so Fresno County, Kern, Kings, Madera, Merced, San Joaquin, Stanislaus, and Tulare. Those 8 counties we included for the Central Valley region.
We'd also like, and maybe Ty, you could put it in the chat, to steer you to our California Immigrant Data Portal, which has lots of data on immigrants for every county in California, I think, except for like the really tiny ones like Alpine and Amador and places like that. And then we also there have hit by lots of municipalities and metropolitan areas for folks to take a look at. For example, in Santa Clara County, their Office of Immigrant Affairs has been using that data quite extensively to do their own strategic planning for services for immigrants. I feel like the California Immigrant Data Portal is working us out of a job, basically, because we're trying to deliver everything online for people to get. It's got a lot of disaggregation by country of origin, so that the differences that I think somebody was pointing to in the chat between different Asian populations and even between different Latin American origin populations can get pointed out.
Thank you. Would you like to respond to the comments by Mandeep Johal? It's a lengthy comment. And I'm glad he uses the term always legendary Dr. Manuel Pastor.
Well, it's also legendary Mandeep Johal. So let me just say, I do think that this is part of what we're trying to do with this presentation, of pointing out that the future isn't always like the past, because I think that, and, obviously as someone who's Latino, I obviously think the Latino community is pretty important, and, that attention should be paid to the large populations like Mexicans, et cetera. But this increasing diversity of the population means a couple of different things. It means that we need to be broadening our analysis to include the experiences of those groups. We need to be doing a lot more disaggregation to be able to catch the nuances of the differences between Indians and Chinese, and as Mandeep was pointing out, between people who speak different languages who come from China, et cetera. I also think that the immigration, the politics of the immigration issue get very closely tied with Latino politics. And while this is not a call for Latino politicians to not pay attention to issues of immigration, it's important to realize that these are important to the Asian population as well, and that we would expect every political figure to want to understand the nuances of the population and to lead on these issues. And I think that the other thing that Mandeep is pointing to, which is really important, is to understand the differences within the difference, to try to disaggregate data, which fortunately the Central Valley is big enough to do. So when you look at the Indian population, to ask the question, do they speak a language other than English at home, and what language is it? So those kind of identifications can be and should be made.
And I'll add to that as well. I think, we are oftentimes limited by the data that's available to really dive in and disaggregate further and further and further as much as it's needed. And so oftentimes we might rely on folks who are on the ground, who have these lived experiences, who work with these communities to really provide additional context for us to, supplement our quantitative research with these narratives, these qualitative findings, because sometimes the data isn't available, but a lot of the folks who are on this webinar have those lived experiences and work with those people. And so we rely on those as well.
Thank you both. In the Q&A, there is a question from Max Vargas. Given the changing nature of work due to things like automation or climate change, how should we be preparing to support our immigrant communities to be economically stable and mobile?
Such a good question. The thoughts that come to my mind immediately is, how do we revamp our workforce development systems to better serve immigrants? And I think there's a couple of simple fixes there that would be really crucial. One is to flood the zone with English as a second language classes. Most of the research shows us that learning English, controlling for everything else, education level, legal status, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is about a 15% jump in your wages, because you're able to move from cleaning rooms to maybe being able to service people at the desk of a hotel, from washing the dishes to being a mesero, a waiter or waitress in the front, et cetera. So English is very important. And as many of you know on the ground, despite the rhetoric, immigrants really do want to learn English, and most of our ESL classes are oversubscribed. So I think we need to flood the zone. English isn't a be all end all, and we do need language access. Don't take it to say we don't, but people want to learn English. They should be given the opportunity to do so. With workforce development systems, I think it's really crucial that these become much more offered in our community colleges in the evenings with childcare for workers. Now, I say this, my dad had a 6th grade education and was a janitor, but he went to LA Trade Tech Community College in downtown LA and learned about electricity. And with the few classes he took, he went from being a janitor to being an air conditioner repairman, repairing industrial air conditioners. And the family went from being poor to being working class. But that's because that workforce development system was actually in the evening and not during the day. Immigrants have a very high rate of labor force participation. And so many of them don't have the time during the day to attend most of the workforce development classes that are out there. So even simple changes like that, providing childcare, those things are really important. And then finally, we really need to open up the unemployment insurance system and the workforce training system to undocumented immigrants so that they can move their way up the mobility ladder as well. Ty, I know you study some of these issues as well. Any thoughts?
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind right away, and I think this is something that we've always been trying to push, again, changing the narrative to giving immigrants and immigrant advocates more power at the policy level, is to include immigrants, to think about immigrants more proactively in a lot of these policies at the state level. So as we're shifting, for example, to green tech, which means more green jobs, et cetera, to include immigrants at the table and coming up with these plans, because they're the ones with those experiences and those ideas of like, well, if we're moving to green tech and more green jobs, is this going to be equitable for those who maybe don't have a lawful status? And if it's not, how can we be sure that they also have the same access, and so that they're not left behind? And so as much as it is about opening a lot of these programs and services to immigrants, it's also about including them in the decision-making process so that we get it right the first time, rather than having to be reactive and trying to get them up to speed.
Thank you. Hugo Morales has a very good question as well. He has several, but one of those, given your experience also with immigrant inclusion policies at the local level, he's asking, are immigrant advisory commissions, are these helpful, like in places like LA and San Jose or Santa Clara County? What has been your experience so far, your impression of immigrant advisory committees?
Sorry, I needed to unmute. So I think they're a positive step when they're accompanied by serious political support and then a desire for the office to ripple out through the entire bureaucracy. So the Santa Clara County Office of Immigrant Affairs, I think it's done a pretty good job, and it's hooked up with folks working more generally on diversity, racial equity issues. So that's given it quite a bit of legs to stand on. One of the ways that it benefits is that in Santa Clara County, business is clear that they rely on immigrants of every skill level. And as a result, the political opposition has been pretty limited. In LA, the experience with the Office of Immigrant Affairs, there's one at the city level and one at the county level. In the city, what's kind of interesting was that that office actually atrophied a bit during the time period of Antonio Villaraigosa. Now, Mayor Villaraigosa was in support of immigrant rights, but he actually felt a little boxed in as a Latino mayor that if he spent too much time on immigrants, that would be perceived as sort of just Latino politicking. And so that office was kind of allowed to atrophy. Eric Garcetti actually revitalized it and put more resources into it. So that's been good. It's the County Office of Immigrant Affairs that to me is the most interesting. Here's the reason why. That was not put in place by a political figure. That was actually a demand by immigrant groups who came up with a whole program, presented it to the county, made sure, of course, that a county supervisor could call it her own so that she could benefit, politically from it coming into being. That's smart. I advise that. But because of that continual support and feedback with immigrant activists themselves, that has been a much more dynamic and supportive office that's been willing to ripple over into other parts of the county bureaucracy and change the way social services are delivered or mental health services are delivered, et cetera. And the Office of Immigrant Affairs at a county level was one of the major groups fighting for what's called the Los Angeles Justice Fund, which is a fund to provide legal representation to undocumented Angelenos who are at the risk of deportation. So that's a pretty bold stand on the part of a county office, but I think it's got to do with its origins. So if the question was, are they useful? I think they are, and they're especially useful if you all in the community push for them, help design them, become the constituency that figures out who will benefit politically from it, rather than it being a top-down creation.
Thank you. Daniel Connell has also a very good question. What strategies should we employ that leverages the demographic changes that are underway in the Central Valley, naturalizing immigrants, preparing immigrants to run for political office, etc.? And Daniel is actively involved in those activities.
I think Daniel just covered that. I would only add one thing. My colleague, Veronica Terikas, who heads the Chicano Studies Research Center at UCLA, you could see how much I like her, that I'm celebrating someone from UCLA. If you know the USC-UCLA rivalry, you'll know the bridges that have just been built. She runs a thing called Dream Summer Central Valley, where she's working with young second generation folks to try to get them to get their elders to naturalize, to encourage them to vote, etc. So the strategies that Daniel mentioned, which are, naturalization, it's often aimed at an older cohort. I do think that training people to run for office, but even before that, to serve on boards and commissions as a kind of training ground for that, really important. But also just mobilizing young people so that they get into the habits of civic life and that they can actually mobilize older people as well. Ty, anything you would add to that?
I think that point really sticks out to me in investing in the youth. I think this next generation of activists are going to be really important in really moving the needle forward. And the thing that I've been seeing a lot of within the immigration rights movement is more focus on the intersectionality part of it. There's a lot of For example, in the past, the undocumented immigrant rights movement borrowed some of the language as well as some of the tools from the LGBTQ rights movement. And so being able to touch back, be able to secure those relationships with these other groups who are really working to, lift from the bottom is really important. And especially among the youth, I think it's very important to really, acknowledge and recognize that these movements, they are very specific about specific groups and their rights, but there's a lot of overlap that will really move the marginalized forward.
Thank you. And there's a comment by Eric Alvarez. He wishes to connect with both of you via email. If you could write your email in the chat box. Any other question or comment from our colleagues here in the Central Valley?
And unlike most academics, we love it when a show ends early.
I told you that you had answered everything. These were extra questions. Now, on behalf of CIVIC and our colleagues, Allison, final thoughts, comments from you?
Hi, thank you both so much for amazing presentation. It's just so much great information, and it's so inspiring that we have so many challenges, but also, tools too at our disposal. So just thanks both so much. I would love to have one final question in our last couple of minutes. I'm just curious about the climate change issue, because I think a lot of us are thinking about how that is motivating a lot of migration around the world, obviously. But I'm just wondering what your projections or forecasts are for the Central Valley as a region to absorb immigrants and others, given the climate challenges in our region. So how will it limit the ag sector so that employment in the ag sector is less of a pool or available employment for people? We're seeing an increase in housing, in new developments and building, but our water supply, is close to reaching its limits. So I don't know how much more our housing capacity is going to be able to increase moving forward. So just kind of where those points are going to intersect with the changing demographics you're describing.
Yeah, and it's not just your water supply, but also your transit availability, because, one of the good things, if we could push growth back into the coasts, is that there's a lot of public transit and a lot of density, so that there's a lot more availability for people to either get out of their cars, the best thing, or to shift when they're using a car to an electric vehicle because of the ubiquity of charging stations, the infrastructure, et cetera. That's much harder to do in the Central Valley. People are trying to do it, but it's just much harder to do. And I think you're right that the Central Valley is going to have some real challenges with carrying capacity for these populations. My hope, but I'm always an optimist by nature, is that we are going to wake up to the reality of climate change and wind up being more aggressive and more assertive about what we need to do at a state level and also at a national level. And then we're going to start to think through the nuances of these different regions, and then also how we compensate for each other. So it's going to be a long haul for you to develop the dense housing and transit systems that we would really want to see from a climate perspective. So how much more does Los Angeles and the Bay Area need to do to make that possible? That's why we ended with, we need to think that there's one California, one Central Valley, and see our fates interconnected. But this climate change thing is going to ripple in ways that are completely unexpected.
Thank you both, Manuel and Ty. To our colleagues who are still with us, just a reminder that on June 21st, we're going to have another very valuable webinar focused on the Digital Equity Act, which is going to distribute billions of dollars across the nation and a lot of money that could be made available to California. That's going to be on the 21st of June. You should have received invitations via the different listservs that we have shared this webinar's information with. So please take a look at that invitation. Sign up if you haven't done it so already. And again, Manuel and Ty, we're tremendously appreciative of the high quality information analysis, the recommendations, the insights that you provide to us in the Central Valley. And we're looking forward to ongoing conversations and collaboration with you to have in-person events once again. I know that the event that I went to at USC was the first in-person event that you had also had for some time, right?
Yes.
So we're really looking forward to having you sometime in the not too distant future here in the Central Valley as well. And thank you everyone for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed it, which I think was the case. And we'll be happy to share the PowerPoint once we get the final version, and it will be sent to everyone who registered. Thank you, everyone.